Well, we have Hilaire de Berrier, who everybody knows. I'm not going to say a single thing about him. I'd rather have him tell you who he is, where he comes from, and what he's doing. Hilaire de Berrier.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Mrs. McKinney forgot to tell you what she told me this afternoon. She said she was going to put up a big sign in here saying, "Cancer cures smoking." I think that's a wonderful idea. You know, I'm awfully pleased and awfully honored to be asked to introduce Medford Evans to you. Because I don't know how you feel about him. I think that he writes the finest book reviews in America. I think that he could take a dime novel and make it sound like a masterpiece in his description of the thing. My only complaint about many of the book reviews that have been run on the American opinion by Medford Evans is that afterwards I've gone out and bought the book and it was never as good as his review of it. However, one of the things I wish he'd take time off to do is to write a story of his own one of these days. The first time I ever saw Medford Evans was about 8 or 9 years ago in Chicago at a conservative meeting. He sat down there and he told us a story of the experiences that happened to him after his period with the atomic energy project, with the atomic bomb project. And you know, it's a marvel that man is still alive. I think that if he would sit down and write that story, have you ever done it, Ed Medford? Have you ever told that story just the way you told it to us?
I don't know what story this is.
You don't? Maybe. He must have been telling that story to my wife. Anyway, I thought it was terrific. You know, the stories of your ill health and the experiences that happened to you after you left the project. And I think that that is better than any...
You mean about what happened to me?
Yes. Yes. I think that that is better than any spy story that we've ever seen in films. And I think that if he would only write that, why then he wouldn't have to worry about what Scott Stanley pays him ever again. He could just write for Scott Stanley for the fun of it, which is of course the dream of all of us. And I forgot to ask him what he's going to talk to you about tonight, but this man is terrific, and whatever he says is going to be in the sort of English that I wish I had been able to master when I'm writing a newsletter. So I'm just going to introduce Medford Evans to you and let him get up here, and if sooner I get him up here at the microphone, why, the happier all of us will be. And Medford, will you take over and tell these people your message?
Hilaire, I certainly thank you for that gracious introduction. I will have to say that what you said about the books and my reviews, that I'm afraid my speech is not going to be as good as the introduction.
You do as much for me sometimes.
But I want to begin, of course, by expressing my own personal appreciation, as always, for the marvelous institution of the New England Rally for God, Family, and Country. And my profoundest appreciation and gratitude to Colonel Bunker and Mrs. McKinney and all the other McKinneys and Mrs. Bowman and all of those who make this institution such a bulwark of liberty. It is a wonderful privilege to be able to come here. Let me ask you, am I on these speakers right? Do you hear me? Okay. Now you will be glad to know that in this typewriter case is not a typewriter, but my speech. That isn't quite literally true, so don't get too panicky. These are books which I'll wave some of them around in a minute. connection with the speech. But before I begin my extemporaneous prepared address, I want to give you a carefully prepared extemporaneous departure from my address. Since coming here, I have myself not been able to read the papers very much, but I understood that we were in the papers, and I did get some of the clippings late and found out some of the organizations that had complained about us. You know, in our relation to the press, by the way, before I speak of the organization, I think that we rally people and other conservatives ought to be we have to learn to be tolerant of the press. I think we're sometimes too hard on them. I'm reminded, I don't go to the movies very often, but I've been to 2 movies in the past 3 years, and one of them was Mary, Queen of Scots. And I think that we can take a moral in our attitude toward the press from Mary, Queen of Scots. You recall, some of you saw that movie, and you know that when Mary is prepared to have her head cut off, as she goes, and it's a very graceful thing, you know, in Henry VIII and all that, these actresses just look so beautiful when they bend down to the block. And I think they like those things because it's not really going to happen to them, but they look real good when they're going to put their head on the block and have it cut off. But in real life, of course, Mary really did have her head cut off. And here, as she's going to the block, she is a queen, a lady, and the man who is going to wield the axe, cut her head off, standing there, and she's standing there, and he said, "Madam, I hope you will forgive me for what I have to do." And she assured him, "I don't blame you at all." Now, as we deal with these people of the press, I think they're going to cut our heads off. But let's be gracious like Mary Queen of Scots and realize that they're just doing, the axeman was just doing what Queen Elizabeth had told him to do, and these people are just doing what they have been told to do by the insiders, if I may coin a term. Now, I've noticed in the press, though, that the Anti-Defamation League of Berrier was severely critical of a book that's on sale here. And a reporter asked me this afternoon what I thought about that, and I said, well, the book is certainly not anti-Semitic, because if you look on the back cover of that book, you will see that I endorsed the book. And I have never at any time been anti-Semitic, and I wouldn't have endorsed a book that was anti-Semitic. So that's my opinion of that. But I want to say something about the Anti-Defamation League. I am not anti-Semitic, but I am Anti-Defamation League. And I think that in its own unique way, the Anti-Defamation League is anti-Semitic. For I would say that the anti-defamation, there would be many ways I could illustrate that point. But there's one very important one, and this is a matter of history and a matter of an interpretation of history, and I'm giving you my interpretation, but I believe I have studied this particular matter about as much as anyone has, and I want to express my judgment that the Anti-Defamation League of Berrier has moral responsibility for the deaths of the so-called atom spies, Judas and Ethel Rosenberg. Let me further express this judgment, and some of this I have said in American Opinion magazine several years ago, and some of you may remember it. the Rosenbergs were framed. The communists are right about that. They ought to know they framed them. The purpose of the Rosenberg show trial, and we know that show trials were developed to their highest peak in Moscow, the purpose of the Rosenberg show trial was twofold. First, to divert attention from really significant security risks such as the late Dr. Julius Robert Oppenheimer, by putting the spotlight on two insignificant and uninformed little communists who were obviously expendable. And second, to convince the American people that the Russians must indeed have the A-bomb because the wicked Rosenbergs had given it to them. And thus establish the credit of the Soviet Union for having nuclear weapons as early as 1949, which was a preposterous fraud. But it doesn't matter these days whether a nation really has atomic weapons or not. All that matters is whether they have the credit for having atomic weapons. A credit card is as good as money. And the now all but universal belief that there are indeed two supernuclear powers has been the basis of all international developments for the past 25 years. And nothing has done quite so much as that to lower the world prestige of the United States of America, this fiction that the Soviet Union has, through a combination of espionage and its own industrial skill, risen to a place where our president will go and sign a treaty giving them on paper superiority to us. That could never have happened if there had not been a publicity build-up of the story that the Russians had their first atomic explosion in September of '49, and incidentally, President Harry Truman, who made that announcement himself, September 1949, and we know now that he made it because Julius Robert Oppenheimer convinced him that he should make it, and for no other reason whatever. But Truman had not been out of office 7 days, but 7 days, when in Kansas City he told a UPI reporter that he did not believe that the Russians had a workable A-bomb. That was Harry Truman who said that. Well, that is simply one illustration of the myth of Soviet nuclear might, which began in the first place with the confession of Dr. Klaus Fuchs in London to William Scarden of Scotland Yard that he had indeed, during his stay at Los Alamos and subsequently, given nuclear secrets to the Russians. Now, at the time of Dr. Fuchs' confession and arrest and trial and sentence to 14 years in prison, that's all he got, 14 years, and he only served 9. It was universally agreed that this man was a repentant communist who was confessing to crimes against the United States. But of course, if he was that, he was in the act of confessing, committing a crime against the communist conspiracy. And if Fuchs was really doing what he seemed to be doing, then as soon as he got out of prison, the NKVD, or the whatever the Soviet secret police were called at that time, would have seen that he got what was coming to him for having betrayed the Soviet Union. But when he got out of that British prison in the summer of 1957, did the Soviet secret police hunt him down like a criminal dog that he would have been had his story been true? No. He was flown in a special plane immediately to East Berlin, received as a very important person, and he is there today as a high official in the East German Communist government and in charge of their atomic energy experimentation. So this is proof positive, I would say, that Klaus Fuchs did what he did on orders from the communist conspiracy. And the question, why did he do it? He confessed because that alone would convince the Americans that the Russians really did have what it takes to become a nuclear power. For you must know that prior to Fuchs' confession, the then Secretary of Defense, Louis Johnson, who later got fired, did not believe what Dr. Oppenheimer said. He said he didn't believe that stuff, and he was right. But after Fuchs confessed, then everybody, for the time being, believed it. So the nuclear credit of the Soviet Union, as far as the upper crust of our own government and as far as the intelligentsia were concerned, was based upon the confession of Klaus Fuchs. Now, I had not meant to say all that, but I get started on this and I say more than I intend to. However, the Fuchs story did not get through to the American public well enough, and therefore it had several important sequels. And these following events were climaxed by the conviction of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, two obscure members of the Communist Party in New York City. And Julius Rosenberg, as far as I have no reason to doubt that he was indeed a spy, but I certainly have every reason to doubt that Ethel Rosenberg was indeed a spy. But I want to say this, that the objective guilt of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg was absolutely trivial compared to the objective guilt not only of Dr. Oppenheimer, but of a dozen top technical and scientific men who were associated with him. Now, Dr. Fuchs was an important scientist, though nothing like so important as Oppenheimer. And yet neither he nor anyone else could give the Russians the A-bomb just by giving them information. You could give me all the information there is on how to build a computer, and I could never build one. For I do not have the training in how to use that information. I do not have the equipment. I do not have the capital. I do not have the resources. And Soviet Russia didn't have the resources in 1949 to build an A-bomb regardless of how much information they had. The only way that the Russians could be significantly helped by us in achieving nuclear capability was to give them the materials and the management assistance just as we are now doing in the case of the Mack truck factory. And as Dr. Anthony Sutton has documented from complete records with the most thorough scholarly techniques, all of the Soviet technology is borrowed from the West. The borrowing has been imperfect, however, and therefore what they do have is used as a pretext for a propaganda buildup of having still more. But the Rosenberg spy thriller was devised to sell the American public, the mass of the American public, really on the concept of Russian success. That was the point of it. They were communists, but they were sacrificed by other communists. The key witnesses in their trial, Harry Gold and David Greenglass, without whose testimony they could not have been convicted, are clearly perjurers. I'm taking too much time already, but I could go through that trial and show you over and over where Harry Gold was a fantastic liar, and what he said at the trial was a fantastic lie. I don't think he ever even went to Santa Fe, because he tells about going to Santa Fe on the Santa Fe Railroad, and he leaves the impression that he got off the train in Santa Fe. And the Santa Fe Railroad doesn't go through Santa Fe. It's an interesting fact that the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe main line doesn't touch either Atchison or Topeka or Santa Fe. You have to get off about 50 miles from Santa Fe and ride the bus. And Harry Gold says nothing about that. But that doesn't matter. There are other things. I just think he's lying there. There are any number of places where it can be proved that he lied. Now, here's the thing. Harry Gold's credibility could have been destroyed by any competent lawyer on cross-examination. And yet Emanuel Block, who was the attorney for the doomed pair, declined to cross-examine. Now, Block was found dead in the bathtub in his apartment in New York some 6 to 8 months after the June 1953 execution of his clients. One more mysterious death of somebody who knew too much. Bremer better be careful. But what about the ADL? The death sentence was passed by Judge Irving Kaufman, now director of Berrier. The prosecuting attorney was Irving R. Sapol, now federal judge, and the performing star of the show was Roy Cohn. Judge Kaufman must have known that it was not true to say, as he did in sentencing the Rosenbergs, that they had given the A-bombs to Russians. Now, I have tried through several years to bring these matters to the attention of the Anti-Defamation League, thinking that they might be interested in even posthumous justice for at least Ethel Rosenberg, who clearly was not guilty of a capital crime. But apparently this self-appointed defender of Judaism was not interested. Of course, my approach to them had to be indirect, since I am certainly not welcome in the ADL office. I hadn't meant to tell you this, but I will. I was acquainted with an editor of a newspaper in a medium-sized southern city. All southern cities are medium-sized, of course. And he was Jewish. And he and I disagreed about everything, but we didn't get personally mad at each other, and we would argue and insult each other intellectually, occasionally meet over a cup of coffee. And one day I said to him, look, I'm studying the Rosenberg case, and I think that the Rosenbergs did get a raw deal, at least comparatively speaking, compared to what other people had got off. Now, you said that you know people in the ADL. He said, yeah, that's right, I do. I said, I know the ADL has tremendous files, and they're bound to know a lot more about the Rosenbergs than I do. And maybe you could get them to give me some information that would help me fill out this picture, which is sketchy. He said, well, that might be. I didn't really expect it to happen, but he was interested. Well, I didn't see him again for about 2 months. Didn't particularly, and just ran into him by accident. And when I did, he said, say, I went to the ADL office in New Orleans, and I told them what you said. I said, there's a guy named Dr. Evans who is interested in the Rosenberg case, and he thinks maybe there's something to be said in their favor. And he thought maybe that if he came talk to you, you might tell him something. And then he said to me, do you know what the ADL official said to me? I said, no, I don't know what he said to you. He said, the official said, if Dr. Evans comes in this office, I'll jump out the window. And I was surely tempted to go. The ADL has a long record of comsimpery. C-O-M-S-Y-M-P-E-R-Y. But they never served the communist cause better than when they made a show of anti-communism by walking past on the other side of the street as Julius and Ethel Rosenberg lay dying. Now let me confess to you that I was certainly deceived and for years thought that the Rosenberg case was on the level, and so, quite obviously, did the late, great Senator Joe McCarthy. But all of us on the non-Semitic right had no such access to information about the Jewish community as does the ADL with its vast files of dossier. And so I charge them with the sin of silence in the matter of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Maybe if they would read more right-wing literature, no, I don't have any hopes about them. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I had not intended to spend so much time on that matter, but I do think it is of consequence. Not only as when I say it is of consequence, I'm not now referring just to the matters of history of espionage that I mentioned, though that is still of tremendous importance since the same sort of thing is still going on. But I refer also to the steady hacking away by such organizations as the ADL at the foundations of American national independence and the American way of life. And I am proud of the fact that they are enemies of this rally. Our topic tonight is less dramatic than that, but possibly of even more enduring importance. I have asked the question, are our public schools part of the great federal kidnap conspiracy? And obviously, I think the answer is yes, because if I thought the answer was no, I wouldn't have bothered to ask the question. But there are certain assumptions in this frankly loaded question. First place, it assumes that a conspiracy exists. It assumes that the federal government is involved in the conspiracy, and it assumes that this conspiracy has for one of its long-scale purposes the abduction of children, and more specifically, the alienation of children from their parents. I am one of the fans of Congressman John Schmitz, and I was thrilled, as you were yesterday, by his great speech. And I was heartened by his intimation, if I read him correctly, that his lady might run for Congress, that he would very likely run for the Senate in 1974, and statements of implicit support for George Wallace in 1972. I've seldom heard a better speaker than Congressman Schmitz, and I'm not a regular recipient of his newsletter, but I got this one as you did. I get another great congressman's newsletter more often, to wit Congressman John Berrier. But I was, of course, enormously interested in this because it starts off with the new Child Development Bill, comment on the new Child Development Bill. And that fit right into a federal conspiracy to kidnap children. Now, this is in the right-wing literature today. I have here a copy of Battle Line, which is a publication of the American Conservative Union, and I happen to be acquainted with the chairman of that organization, named M. Stanton Evans, related to me by his birth by my wife. And the lead article in this is the attack on the family. This was published just before the Senate vote, but I want to read you this as an eloquent expression. This is not written by Stanton, but it's endorsed by him. The attack on the family. A mounting body of evidence makes it clear that the federal planners have projected a major qualitative leap in the scope and intensity of government intervention. We have in recent years become a regimented society. Now we are on the brink of becoming a totalitarian one. The major thrust of totalitarian activity in the 20th century has been the attack on the family, an effort to break the link between child and parent, to assert the paramount interest of the state above the interest of the family unit, and to shape the psyche of the child to patterns dictated by the social engineers and experts. The object of this policy is to ensure that rising generations are molded to the tastes of government and not permitted to wander off in counter-revolutionary byways. We've all of us good conservatives, such as come to the New England rally, have been concerned about this ever since last winter, at least, when the Senate passed a similar bill. I referred to it in American Opinion. I'll now quote myself there, if I may. Mainly to call attention to a key name. In the forefront of this attack on the family, we find such men as psychology professor Uri, that's spelled U-R-I-E, Bronfenbrenner, B-R-O-N-F-E-N-B-R-E-N-N-E-R, Uri Bronfenbrenner of Cornell, author of a book, Two Worlds of Children, a book in which he compares Soviet and American methods of child care to the considerable advantage of the Soviets. Naturally, after that kind of endorsement of communism, Professor Bronfenbrenner was signed up for a star role in the December 1970 White House Conference on Children. That's exactly the sort of man that the White House wants to advise us on what we should do with children. And Dr. Bronfenbrenner is quoted as saying, "The battle today," now I don't know what battle he's talking about, but I think he's talking about the same one you and I are. "The battle today is not between children and parents, not a generation gap. The battle is between society on one side and families on the other. Society is against the family. And we, now I don't know, we here apparently means the scientific community. We've got to reorder things so that human values can again get some recognition. Those will be some human values when we have a state in which the children are taken from their parents. Now he says this thing which is very true, and often we find that the enemy says true things if you look at them from the point of view of tactics. Sometimes I hear people say, well, we don't want to do so-and-so because that's what the communists do. Which always, that's to me, that's parallel to the quarterback on the football team, when the coach tells him to do so-and-so, he said, well, Coach, I don't want to throw a successful pass because that's what the enemy does. That's what the other team does. Yeah, that's what they do. You're playing the same game, but you're trying to beat them. They're trying to beat you. Now, Bronfenbrenner, who quite clearly is the enemy in this thing, says if you want to turn a society around, it's around children that you have the hope of doing it. Please notice that to turn around is a precise translation of revolution. The revolution is a turning around. So he's saying if you want to revolutionize society, you got to do it through the children. Well, you may say that's some mad genius on a university faculty, and they say things like that. They sure do, by the way. So let me read you the same idea in a different kind of document. This is a booklet called School Racial Policy, and it's published by the American Association of School Administrators, 1201 16th Street, Northwest Washington, D.C. These are the men who run the public school system of America. And they say, or their booklet says, the American public schools today are charged with an unprecedented task. An unprecedented task. Heretofore, their task has been to teach something, but now they got an unprecedented task. It's different from teaching something. Charged with an unprecedented task, not to perpetuate a culture, but to transform it, revolutionize it again. Now, the American people did establish the public school system in order to perpetuate a culture. That is all in God's world, and don't forget whose world it is, that the schools were established for. And here are the school administrators of the nation saying, we don't think the schools are to perpetuate the culture. We think the schools are to revolutionize society. So no wonder they permit the SDS to organize in the high school. No wonder we have a drug problem. Right on with the revolution. With the administrators on the surface winking at it and committed to a policy which actively promotes it. The most influential schoolman in recent years has probably been Professor James S. Coleman of Johns Hopkins University. This is a hard book to get. I'm not going to read that to you, but I want to hold it up if my arm holds out. This is the Coleman Report on the Equality of Educational Opportunity, authorized by Congress in 1964 and completed in 1966. And now, not satisfied with a tome of this size, the Harvard Graduate School of Education, under the leadership of Professor Frederick Mosteller and a man who has been in politics, Professor Daniel P. Moynihan, worked 3 years, take it back, worked 6 years to bring out this book explaining that book. On Equality of Educational Opportunity, a seminar on the Coleman Report. I show you those. I'm not going to go into what's in them because they're too big, even for anybody's long-winded as I am. But in order to point out to you how important Professor Coleman is. And then I show you Xerox of an article that he had in a periodical called The Public Interest, in which he said, see, his study, and this was it was one of the biggest studies of social science in the history of man, and said to be, by the social scientists, the most important. And it shook him up, because what he did, the statistics that he gathered seemed to show that it doesn't make any difference how much money you spend on schools, but the schools that have a low cost are just as good as those that have a high cost, or those that have a high cost are just as bad as those that have a low cost, however you want to look at it. It doesn't make any difference whether the classes are large or small. That's very surprising to some people. It doesn't make any difference what kind of buildings you have. It doesn't make any difference what kind of teachers you have. None of those things affect achievement, affect educational achievement. The only thing that affects educational achievement is cultural and family background, very dramatically illustrated by the division between the races, but not limited to that. Now here then is a study which says it doesn't matter how much money you spend, it doesn't matter how long the school year is, it doesn't matter about the size of the classes, and over again, doesn't matter how much money you spend. All that matters is family background. So what do we do? Well, the first thing we do is to spend more money. That's repeated over and over. Having proved that it doesn't make any difference how much money you spend, the conclusion is we must spend more money, which illustrates a point that I've tried to make in the past, and I'm very happy to see that Scott Stanley, now let me put in a good word for Scott here, Hilaire, because he quotes this in the They Paused to Remark bed in the Last American Opinion and credits me with it, which is that the purpose of government spending is to increase the power of the government. It doesn't have anything to do with what you spend the money for. If you spend money on schools, you're not trying to make better schools, you're just trying to make the government hold on the schools stronger. But Professor Coleman and his associates don't stop with advocating vast increases in expenditure. They go on to say, since the family background is so important, we've got to get these children away from their families sooner, at least 3 years sooner, and keep them away longer. And this means not only the age of the children, but the length of the day. We've got to get them earlier in the morning and keep them longer in the afternoon. And this is why the longer the bus travels, the better. Because the longer the bus travels, the sooner the kid has to leave home and the longer it takes him to get back. And he won't be subjected to the corrupt influences of his own parents. Now that is the philosophy back of this thing. And that was very much the philosophy of this man that Massachusetts is so lucky to get rid of, Neil Sullivan. Now that's where all this agitation for child development and daycare centers, which is going to cost billions of dollars. See what a wonderful program that is from the bureaucrat's point of view. Spend billions and billions of dollars and have control of the infants from the cradle on. Get the mothers out of the way. The purpose of that is not to help the family budget so much as to keep the mothers from raising their own children. And that's where this child development thing comes from. Now, going back to this newsletter of Congressman Smith's, he talks then about the bill which says, well, I'll just read you what he said. On June 20th, the U.S. Senate passed by a vote of 73 to 12 the 1972 version of the Child Development Bill passed by Congress last year, and he refers to a former newsletter of his, but vetoed by the President in a remarkable concession to a thoroughly aroused public opinion. That's very neatly written. The differences between the 1971 and 1972 bills are minimal, involving no more than incidental details. The essential purpose and nature of the legislation remain the same. This year's bill number is S3617. The time to begin an all-out fight against it through letters to members of the House of Representatives, where it will now go, and to the President, is now. And I certainly 1,000% endorse the congressman's recommendation there. Write your congressman, write the White House, blasting S3617, child development. Such a fight succeeded last year, says John Schmitz. It can be won again. The American people are no more ready now than they were 6 months ago to accept, and here's his description of the child development daycare centers, massive government invasion of the home and government assumption of responsibility for children of preschool age. Now I want to take up where Congressman John Schmitz left off. If it is an attack on the family and government assumption of otherwise parental responsibility, in the case of children of preschool age, what about children of school age? Why is it so bad to let the bureaucrats take the 4 and 5-year-olds away from their parents, and perfectly all right to let them take the 7 and 8-year-olds away? And the answer is it isn't all right at all. And it never has been all right. This is possibly the most serious and most difficult subject that one can talk about to an American audience, because all of us have a deep emotional commitment to the American public school system and are indebted to it. I went to public schools in the states of Tennessee, Texas, and Oklahoma, graduating from high school in Shawnee, Oklahoma, 1923. And I am deeply grateful to the splendid teachers that I had in many of those schools, and grateful to the principals and the superintendents and the school boards and the taxpayers who did all that. But you know, in those days, the reins of government were very relaxed on the schools. And the schools were in Shawnee, Oklahoma. The teachers didn't teach anything that the parents and the voters of that city would have found intolerable. But today, all over the United States, school administrations are busily engaged in doing that which everyone acknowledges the patrons don't want done. You know what the popular opinion on the matter of forced busing to achieve racial balance is. There must be 90% of the American people, black and white, who are opposed to forced busing. And that doesn't make any difference whatever to James S. Coleman and Daniel Moynihan and the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare and the federal judiciary. They say, in effect, the hell with what the people want. We're going to bust the kids because the power of government is shown when it is exercised against the consent of the governed. And I think that Richard Nixon could never have gone to Peking and Moscow and spoken as an equal with Mao Zedong and Brezhnev if he hadn't been able to indicate that he too was master in his own country, and that he too could do things whether his people liked it or not. There are many reasons why we as a nation made a terrible historic mistake in developing the public school system. For that, those public schools that I knew and that you knew couple of generations ago, most of you not as long ago as I, but some of you, they had the seeds within them of what is going on now. It is customary, of course, in right-wing circles to blame everything bad about popular education on John Dewey, and certainly John Dewey has terrible sins to answer for in this regard, and yet the evil is older than that. It is really inherent in a system of government-operated schools in such a nation as ours. And I'll tell you why. The quickest way to demonstrate this is to point out that education is basically a religious function. Now, there is no way to run a school system without getting into religious questions. You obviously cannot teach history without bringing up religious questions. How do you explain to children why this is the year 1972? This is 1972 because the point of reference was the birth of Jesus Christ. You've got to tell the kid that, haven't you? And he's going to say, who was Jesus Christ? And when Jesus said, whom do men say that I am? And any possible answer to that question is a religious answer, isn't it? Simon Peter's answer, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God, is the Christian answer. And that he is an impostor was the answer of those who did not accept him and heard him. And of course, we don't know was the answer. We don't know is the answer of the heathen savages to whom literacy had never come, and also of the most advanced intellectuals of Europe and America. The only kinds of people in the world who say they are ignorant about God are the most brutal and ignorant of savages and the most ethereal of intellectuals, accepting the doctrines of Thomas Henry Huxley. But notice that agnosticism, so expressed, is itself a religious position. So you can't answer that question without taking a religious position. And therefore, in the classroom, you are going to have to take a religious position on that. There are many details. And I mentioned Mary Queen of Scots at the outset. Now, suppose you're in a public school teaching history, and you're teaching English history, and some child says, was Elizabeth the rightful Queen of England? What are you going to say? If you say yes, you're a Protestant. If you're a Catholic, of course, you may be diplomatic and not say anything, but you know what you think. Elizabeth's mother was not legally married to Henry according to the Church of Rome. You didn't hear what my opinion is on this matter. And you're not going to. It is part of the British Constitution that no Catholic can be King of England. That was made part of the Constitution in 1688 when they ran James II out, for no reason in the world except that he was a Catholic. Now, what do you do with that in the public schools? Well, you just duck it, that's all. That's just like I'm doing now. And if that were the only question, okay, not too bad. But listen, questions like that keep coming up over and over and over. Now, all this business about sex education, which is plaguing us today, I've referred to historical matters involving religion, but when you get to morality, then more obviously it involves it. In sex education, what do they teach? By the way, Notice that because we have the theory that you're not supposed to have religious instruction in the public schools, that any public school teacher that got up there in a class in sex education and used St. Paul as his authority. Now listen, there's a lot of sex education in St. Paul. You read the first couple of chapters of Romans. I wrote an article about involving sex in American Opinion a year or so ago, and I made the statement that the Bible which so repeatedly condemns male homosexuality doesn't say anything about female homosexuality, one way or the other. And I got more mail on that than anything else I ever wrote. Indignant mail. People telling me that how dumb and wrong I was, and they quoted the first chapter of Romans. I'm not going to go into possible different interpretations of that, but the point is that St. Paul dealt with these matters. By the way, most of those readers who were indignant because I seemed to be a little bit more tolerant toward female and male homosexuality were ladies. But notice that a sex education teacher can't get up in the public schools and read what St. Paul says about fornication and adultery and homosexuality. No, that's out because that's religion. What the teacher has to do is explain all these things and tell the children to choose which one they like the best. They absolutely try to separate morality from sex. They say so in that case. Now, in these other cases, they don't even think about what I referred to before. But they think about this themselves. They think about it. And so they say, we are not going to teach sexual morality. We're just going to teach the facts. Well, I don't know any better prescription for immorality than just to teach the facts. And you come right down to it, there's not all that much to teach, is there? There's just so much. The morality is the important part. The relationship between sex and love and religion, fidelity, that's what it is all about. And the so-called facts of life are trivial in comparison. But the government education, partly because it can't do anything else and partly because what it wants to do is to train a generation of libertines. Well, I could multiply illustrations endlessly of the inextricable interweaving of religion and education. But I think since most of you already agree about it anyway, I think I've made the point well enough. But our government is not supposed to have religious toleration, because there are too many different religions. Well, if you've got all these different religions and education is a religious function, it follows that you've got to have a lot of different kinds of schools. You can't have, if you will pardon the word, a monolithic school system, because you can't have a monolithic religion. And therefore, the only answer to this dilemma of whether the public schools either teach religion, which is a violation of the Constitution, or they don't teach anything, which is a violation of their main duty, is to have private schools. And to let every denomination have its own schools, and to let the agnostics have their own schools. And if the atheists can get up a quorum, let them have a school. But the government doesn't run schools because the government doesn't take a religious position. The government offers defense. What it's supposed to do, it doesn't. That isn't at all what it does. But the government is supposed to offer defense and law enforcement, period. So this vast function should be turned back to private enterprise. Now, instead of that, of course, I'm not going to go into the fact I think that's really going to happen. It's going to take a long time to happen. And I will remind you, I spoke last year about the fact that private schools are already starting. Well, they've grown a lot. We've got the council school system in Jackson, Mississippi, now has 8 operating locations with a combined enrollment of 6,000 students. And this is, there are other private schools in Jackson. All the private schools in Jackson put together have more students than there are white students in the public schools in that city of 250,000. So the private school movement is coming along. It is still, however, quite small compared as yet to the public school movement. The public school movement, though it is diminishing in enrollment, is increasing in cost. And we're back, and this is the point I want to end on, because this is a very practical point, and one that something can be done about if people are sufficiently aroused. If I had a blackboard, I would draw you a graph of the cost of public schools in the United States in this century, from 1900 through 1971, which is the last year for which I have any statistics. In 1900, the public schools of this country cost $250 million, which is $250 million. In 1971, the public schools of the United States cost $45 billion. In 1960, you say, well, 1900 is a long time ago, of course it's going to go up. Okay, but in 1960, only the beginning of the decade, 11 years earlier than the figure I gave you, this past year is obviously going to pass 50 billion, but 45 billion. 1960, it was just 15 billion. So the cost of the public schools multiplied by a factor of 3 in one decade. Now that curve, Dr. Suhawk pointed out about the HEW curve. Well, that curve, of course, the figures I'm giving you are not just federal expenditures, they're federal and state and local. And that curve rises even more sharply than she indicated as far as education is concerned. So if the schools cost $45 billion last year and the trend continues, in another 10 years they'll cost $200 billion. Education is, now that's just 12th grade public schools. That's leaving out private schools, that's leaving out college, kindergarten. You put in the others, and the cost of education in 1971 in this country, of education, was $75 billion, or 7.7% of the gross national product. And that is intrinsically shocking, but it isn't half so shocking as it becomes when you consider that they weren't teaching anybody anything except maybe a little sex education. There have been, I'm going to sign off here real fast, but there have been systematic reports on achievement, particularly in the field of English composition, reading, and writing, which validate what you and I have suspected for years, that the graduates of our high schools may be illiterate. There's no guarantee. Now, some of the high school graduates are brilliant, so they may be smart, but there's no guarantee just because they've been to college 12 years in the greatest cities in America, even Boston, although the city I saw talked about was Chicago. The fact that someone has graduated from a high school in Chicago doesn't mean that he can read and write. Or New York. New York has the most fantastically expensive public school system in the world. You know what the poor underpaid teachers make in the New York school system? On an average, $15,000 for 9 months. You get off at 3 o'clock. It's nice work if you can get it, but they don't think so. They strike for more. And again, that wouldn't be intolerable if they taught them anything, but they don't. Now this increasing tax burden must be reduced because it itself is intolerable and because it supports an institution which is basically totalitarian. When we think about that $50 billion and the miserable achievement tests of the students, we should remember the words of the prophet Isaiah, in the 55th chapter in the 2nd verse, and he said, "Wherefore do ye spend money for that which is not bread?" And with that thought, I'll leave you.
Thank you, Medford, and thank you, Hilaire. And I know how magnificent this was, but all the time that Medford Evans was talking, I couldn't help but think, where are our men? What does it need when I went to school, if I ever came home and told my father and mother or my brothers what they're teaching in the schools and what they're doing, my father or my mother would have gone up and beat their brains out. And I can't help thinking about our ancestors. They came over here to a wilderness with picks and shovels, and they fought the Indians, and they built the log cabins, and out of that they built this great nation. And with all we have, all the education and the money and the brains and able to read, and probably that helped a lot. They weren't able to read. Well, anyway, I just hope and pray to God that He will send us some men to lead us out of this terrible thing. And I know there are some members of the John Birch Society here, and I'm a member of the John Birch Society, and I often wonder what this country would have been like if there had never been a John Birch Society.